Look at these spices. Before the modern financial system, tangible luxury goods gave India an incomparable economic position, making it the center of global wealth. People from across the world traveled there because European markets demanded a constant supply of very specific Indian commodities. They needed muslin, fine silk cloth, indigo for dyes, and spices to preserve their food. To move these goods, merchants relied on an intricate, sprawling network of overland paths and maritime shipping lanes connecting the Indian subcontinent directly to Europe. On this map, the old waterway line illustrates a critical geographic reality. All of these sprawling trade networks eventually converged on one single intersection point, the city of Istanbul, then known as Constantinople, in modern-day Turkey. Relying on a single geographic choke point meant the entire European economy was effectively held hostage by local politics. Whoever controlled that single city controlled Europe's food preservation and textile industries. In the year 1453 AD, Turkish Muslims conquered Constantinople. The primary gateway for global trade was instantly sealed shut. The immediate consequence was total embargo. The vital sea and land routes passing through the city were completely closed off to European merchants. European nations were completely cut off from the spices and textiles needed to survive winters and maintain their economies. Panic set in. With traditional trade severed, finding an alternative path to India became a desperate necessity for national survival. This massive supply chain crisis directly triggered the era of geographical discoveries. Backed by the Portuguese crown, brave sailors started pushing down the perilous Atlantic coast of Africa. Early explorers like Bartholomew Diaz pushed through harsh waters to discover the rocky shores of the Cape of Good Hope. Other nations threw resources in entirely different directions. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west for the Spanish crown, convinced he had found a new route to India, though he had actually landed in the Americas. This map details the actual breakthrough. Tracing the dotted line around Africa, we see the voyage of Portuguese sailor Vasco da Gama. In 1498, with the guidance of an Indian sailor, he successfully reached the western coast of India at Calicut. The local King Zamorin welcomed da Gama and allowed the Portuguese to conduct business. By reaching the subcontinent first, Portugal secured a massive advantage, effectively monopolizing this highly profitable trade network for the next century. Looking at the markers on this map, you can see how the Portuguese entrenched their power. Within 100 years, they had established firm physical control over key Western territories, setting up heavily fortified trade centers in Diu, Daman, and Goa. The continental blockade had been completely bypassed. A direct maritime connection was established, opening India's vast economic resources to any European nation with ships capable of making the journey. Witnessing Portugal's massive wealth, English traders organized to take their cut. In 1600 AD, they formed the East India Company, operating under an official charter and explicit permission from Queen Elizabeth of England. Under Captain William Hawkins, their first ship arrived in Surat, but the Portuguese were already heavily entrenched there, using their dominance and military opposition to successfully block the English from setting up a foothold. It took over a decade of pressure and negotiation to break this gridlock. Finally, in 1613 AD, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir granted the East India Company permission to establish their first official trade center in Surat. Even with this foothold, their survival wasn't guaranteed. The local Maratha Empire commanded massive power in the western region, posing a serious physical danger to the fledgling British outposts. Sensing this threat to their existence, the company shifted its strategy. They moved away from the Marathas, expanding south and east to set up safer, more heavily fortified centers in places like Chennai, then called St. George, and Calcutta at Fort William. British expansion across India was defined by a series of tactical retreats, relocations, and careful navigations around dominant local powers as the company sought to secure its trade routes. This map also identifies the arrival of the final piece of the puzzle. The French East India Company arrived for trade in 1668, rapidly establishing their own centers in places like Pondicherry and Chandranagar, putting them in direct, uncomfortable proximity to British operations. Throughout the 18th century, the competition evolved. The English and the French stopped focusing solely on maximizing trade profits and began aggressively conquering territory to establish total ruling dominance. This tension inevitably erupted into the Carnatic Wars. Between 1746 and 1763, the French and British East India Companies fought 3 brutal, widespread military campaigns against each other for control of the continent. The British forces thoroughly defeated the French East India Company. By winning this war, they effectively eliminated the only other foreign power capable of challenging their expansion. The board was now clear. The French had been militarily defeated, and the initial pioneers, the Portuguese, were marginalized to just a few coastal strongholds. As this map of Hindustan illustrates, the East India Company had evolved into a dominant military and political force, positioned to control vast, heavily populated regions. The political blockade in Turkey sparked widespread panic, which forced sailors around the southern tip of Africa, bringing armed European corporations to Indian shores, where they systematically dismantled their rivals. The British Raj, an empire that controlled the subcontinent and its massive economy for nearly 2 centuries, was the ultimate result of a broken supply chain.